Kristen Hovet. Kristen is a late-diagnosed autistic individual who founded the Other Autism, a platform that challenges autism myths and highlights late diagnoses. Kristen's presentation is entitled The Importance of Hobbies for Mental Health and Wellbeing. Hobbies can be another word for special interests, but hobbies is a word that is more easily identifiable and has very little stigma attached. However, for many late-diagnosed, high-masking autistics, partaking in hobbies, special interests, can feel self-indulgent, but maintaining hobbies is so important to our mental and physical health.
Kristen Hovet est une personne autiste diagnostiquée tardivement qui a fondé The Other Autism, une plateforme qui remet en question les mythes sur l'autisme qui souligne les diagnostics tardifs, l'importance des loisirs pour la santé mentale et le bien-être. Les passe-temps peuvent être un autre mot pour des intérêts spéciaux, mais c'est un mot qui est plus facilement identifiable et qui est très peu stigmatisé. Cependant, pour de nombreux autismes à haut masquage diagnostiqués tardivement, prendre part à des passe-temps, des intérêts spéciaux, peuvent sembler de faire ce qui nous intéresse seulement. Mais le maintien des passe-temps est très important pour notre santé mentale et physique.
My name is Kristen Hovet, and I'm the autistic host of the Other Autism podcast, a podcast that explores late diagnosed autism and the latest in autism research. I also interview autistic guests and seek to challenge myths and stereotypes about autism and autistic people. The topic I'd like to discuss today, which is the importance of hobbies for autistic folks' health and well-being, was inspired by an episode of my podcast called What Can Occupational Therapy Do for Autistic Adults? An interview with Courtney Benner. In this interview, Courtney briefly mentioned the importance of hobbies, which really piqued my interest in exploring this more, since I have only relatively recently, like in the last couple of years, started getting back into what I would call my core hobbies or interests. I had a long period in my life where I experienced guilt and shame when it came to pursuing these hobbies. And so thinking about this made me want to look into it further, to both look into the topic itself and the word itself, as well as the ways my own thoughts and feelings about hobbies have changed since my diagnosis. While I'm definitely coming at this topic from a late diagnosed, high masking autistic perspective, I think many autistic individuals and those who love them can benefit from this information. Before we go any further, I think it's important to define the terms I'll be using today. And part of working on this presentation was actually looking at the formal definitions of hobbies and how people use the term. Hobbies are defined as activities that people take part in, usually during their leisure time for pleasure and relaxation. For autistic people, hobbies are so much more than that. You may have already suspected where I'm going with this, and that is to talk about special interests. While many people use the terms hobbies and special interests interchangeably, I actually don't think autistic people really have hobbies in the sense of the word that most people use it. We are too intensely focused on our activities and interests for them to be exactly leisurely. Another way to say this is we don't have hobbies, we have passions. And all that being said, I chose to keep the word hobbies, at least to start, as it's really easily identifiable. It's used in several autism support and educational programs, and it's used by many occupational therapists, many of whom work with autistic folks. And unlike special interests, the word hobbies has very little stigma attached. Special interests in the context of autism are defined as intense and highly focused interests or passions and can include any subject, topic, or activity imaginable. Some autistic folks are super into movies, animals, crafts, space, music, computers, gardening, art, politics, environment, history, science, even makeup and celebrities or specific people can become our special interests. The list really goes on and on. Many of our special interests are similar to the interests of neurotypicals or non-autistics, but we tend to get into our special interests at a much deeper level, spend more hours of our days and years of our lives devoted to our special interests, and tend to have special interests that we can pursue on our own time, or at least mostly solo. We also tend to have more interests than neurotypicals or non-autistic folks, which is actually a fact that's completely contrary to old and outmoded ideas that autistics tend to have very limited interests. Special interests are so important that they actually count as some of the core features of being autistic. And what's it like for an autistic person who's deeply engaged in a special interest? Well, it's common for us to experience a state of flow where we don't even notice the passing of time. When in this state of flow, it's common to experience what some call a feeling of total bliss or intense pleasure. And we also tend to display really deep, focused thinking. The one downside that some autistics talk about is that it can be very challenging to pull ourselves away from a special interest, especially once we get into that flow state. Nowadays, autistic individuals who are identified as autistic early on, like in early childhood, are often encouraged to identify and pursue their special interests and to develop community around these passions. Those of us who were diagnosed later in life, however, often had the opposite kind of experience. We often at some point find ourselves distanced from our special interests, or we have a very difficult or interrupted relationship with them, maybe a fragmented relationship with them. It's often well after our diagnosis that we begin to explore or even develop our special interests, sometimes for the first time ever, or at least the first time since childhood. I have even met some newly diagnosed autistic adults who claim to have no special interests. I think because they were shamed to such a degree about their special interests early on that they have denied those things for themselves. And I really hope that they can begin to explore and nurture their special interests and the profoundly positive effects those interests can have on overall health and mental health and well-being. And here I'd like to tell you a story about myself, my pre-autism diagnosis self. As you know, even if you're not identified as autistic yet, you're still autistic, and such was the case with me. I was autistic from the very beginning, from birth, but did not know it until a couple days before my 39th birthday. For as long as I can remember, I've had some core special interests related to music, language, and learning. As a child, what this looked like was hours and hours and hours spent listening to records and then tapes, making mixed tapes, recording myself talking and reciting things, writing stories and poetry and long, long letters to relatives, whether or not they wanted them, reading till the very early hours of the morning, even on school nights and without my parents knowing, doing extra schoolwork related to language and comprehension, practicing instruments for much longer than was required for band class, writing essays about animal biology and history topics for fun, and reading my encyclopedias cover to cover. None of these things were done to be the best in any of these areas. I want to make that very clear. That didn't even cross my mind for a second. Also, it was like the more I pursued these things, the more passionate I became about them, and the more I wanted to know. And indeed, the research is right in line with my experience. Research cited by Rachel Groves and their team found that autistic individuals were mainly motivated by internal or intrinsic factors, such as interest and knowledge, when it came to special interests. And they were far less motivated or even not at all motivated by external or extrinsic factors, such as praise, prestige, or advancement. For me, pursuing these activities and topics and learning and acquiring new knowledge was so deeply gratifying in itself and gave me both intense joy and an overwhelming sense of awe. To get down to individual details, I often get full body tingles while I'm deeply focused on a special interest. Who would not want that? However, as a child, it did not take long to realize that my interests in all of these topics and activities I mentioned were considered overboard or too much by most people's standards. Whenever I talked about my special interests, I would often go into great detail and cause others to get frustrated or annoyed or bored with me. Some of them said so. Others made faces or chose to make fun of me. I got called weird and too intense. Many laughed and didn't tell me why they were laughing, leaving me to guess. And what I guessed was that something was very wrong with me, that I was so far from normal that I needed to change. Barring that, if unable to change, I knew I had to learn how to pretend, mask my true self, and hide what I loved most. Because I also realized around that same time that if I spoke less about what I loved, about my passions, people seemed to like me more. Eventually, I started to spend less time on my special interests and tried to be like my peers as much as humanly possible. I spent more time on things I wasn't very interested in, simply as a way to try to fit in. I never totally gave up my passions, but I would pursue them mostly in secret and definitely refused to talk about them in any amount of detail. In general, I became quieter and quieter because the less I spoke, the less chance of messing up, of getting too intense about something, of getting too excited about my favorite things in front of others, of basically giving myself, my true self, away. It wasn't until I learned I'm autistic that I became aware of just how much of myself I'd lost to masking, how much I'd lost to pretending to be someone I wasn't, and how much of my light had been dimmed through denying myself the countless benefits of my special interests. I realized I'd been forced to hide myself, both from others and from myself. I found that I was on a career path suddenly that didn't feel at all right. I didn't know who I was or what I wanted from life. I had no idea. I was so lost. So I went back to the basics. I started pursuing my original passions without shame. I uncovered and developed new ones one day at a time. And I have to emphasize the fact that this was an entire process that's much easier said than done, especially after nearly 4 decades of heavy masking. But I'm happy to say I slowly carved a place for myself that makes sense. I have a job that allows me to read, write, and focus on knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. My passion projects allow me to write even more, as well as edit audio tracks and make music. I've found a small group of people with whom I can share my passions, who provide a small but safe space for me to be fully myself without shame. I am a work in progress, but I've come a long way in the last few years since my diagnosis. And I'd like to end with the idea that for autistic folks, wholeheartedly embracing our special interests supports health and well-being in ways that I feel the world is just starting to understand. We know from relatively recent research that autistic people who spend time pursuing their special interests are happier, have a stronger sense of themselves and their self-identity, and report higher self-esteem and confidence, as well as reduced anxiety and reduced stress. Our special interests are core to who we are, what we love, what we live for. They give us purpose and joy. Special interests put us in touch with our creativity, help us to develop and hone this creativity, and can lead to new careers and educational pursuits by helping us develop true expertise in valuable skills and subject matters. Pete Warmby, an autistic author and former teacher, calls special interests life-affirming and life-allowing. I started this presentation by calling these hobbies, but they are clearly so much more. Hobbies are extra activities done at the edges of life when we have a bit of spare time and we're not working and we're not studying. Special interests, on the other hand, passions, fuel us. They give us life. They become our livelihoods, and they run straight through and emerge from the core of ourselves and our souls. If you're autistic and feeling out of touch or disconnected from your special interests, I challenge you to find a way back to them in whatever way you can. I know we all have different capacities and time and resources, but in whatever small way you can, I challenge you to move toward your special interests and embrace them. And if you are someone who loves an autistic person, I challenge you to do whatever you can to support and nurture that person's special interests. Thank you so much for your time. Until next time.